Back when I used to work in independent wine retail, sometimes I'd have customers coming into the shop asking about a wine they might have had at a wine bar or restaurant the previous night. And they would try and describe what it was, but they couldn't remember the name of it. And I would always tell people that all they needed to do is just take out their iPhone and take a picture of the wine and then bring it in, and then we might be able to help them. But there's actually an even better resource for people now, which you can use with your iPhone. It's basically an app called Vinous, which recognizes any wine from just the snap of a picture. All you need to do is open the app, take a picture of the label, and the app will actually recognize the wine just from that information. And you can then give it a rating, make some comments if you wanted to, and share it with a network. So that might be people who follow you on the app itself, or even you can hook it up with stuff like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can also follow people, other wine lovers, even wine professionals like myself, and find out what wines they're tasting, wines they recommend. So if you see a wine on there that you are interested in trying, you can add it to a wish list. And you can also find out really accurate information about where you might be able to purchase it and how much you might be expected to pay, because the app is only for users in Australia and New Zealand. And basically, it's changing the way that we enjoy wine. So I highly recommend going to www.getvinous.com/Vincast, download the app, and start snapping away. Hello there, Vincasters. Welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and we have had some really great episodes of late. I hope you've been enjoying them. Particularly last week's episode with Dave Brooks was a really fascinating chat. He's such a great character, and I highly recommend listening to it if you haven't already. As always, I would love to hear from you guys. If you can visit me at intrepidwino.com, there's lots of ways you can share and comment both the podcast and some of my writing. But I really would love for you guys to jump onto places like iTunes and Stitcher, subscribe to the podcast there, and whilst you're there, please do rate and review. I would really love to hear from you, get some feedback, any questions you might have, or suggestions as far as guests. All feedback is welcome. But for this week, I have got another returning guest, but it's his second episode. The last one was actually all the way back in episode 4, which I think was over a year ago now. His name is Daniel Honan, and if you remember, or if you don't, he's otherwise known as the Wine Idealist. He has a really fascinating blog writing about sustainable and natural wines being produced in Australia and New Zealand. But he's had a really busy 2014, so we had a great chat about some of the stuff he's been doing, but also some of the stuff he's got coming up in 2015. But for this episode, we are focusing a lot on wine festivals, because both of us attended a number of different festivals this year, and so we thought it would be interesting to talk about what they are and how people can best take advantage of them. So I hope you enjoy, and see you on the other side. Dan, it's great to hear your voice, mate. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, James. It's good to hear yours as well, mate. It's been a while since we spoke.
Yeah, I think it was about a year ago that you were on the pretty early episode in the podcast when you were on your road trip down to Victoria and Melbourne. But I believe you've had a pretty busy year. What have you been up to?
It has been a pretty busy year at One Idealist HQ, I suppose. Yeah, I saw you last year in Melbourne, and it was a lot of fun on that road trip. And since then, I've made some wine earlier this year in the Hunter Valley during Vintage.
Wow.
Went to London in April to give a seminar at the Real Wine Fair. And, oh gosh, in March I was in Marlborough doing a story on the Mana Group over there for various publications.
Yep.
And far out, man, now you've actually made me remember what I've done in the year. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, yeah, I mean, you had a printed little guide of some of the Australian producers working in that kind of sustainable and more natural gear as well. I think you sent me a copy of it. It was fantastic.
That's right. Yeah, no, wine idealism. I sort of collated together a whole bunch of past editions of the Wine Idealist into a little booklet, and also released it as an ebook. So it was just sort of a bit of. I actually use it instead of cards. So when people ask me, "Oh, do you have a card? Can I have your contact details?" I usually whip out a booklet, and it's kind of cool because you get actual stories as well as contact details. So it's probably a bit geeky, but yeah, it's cool.
That's awesome. And how are things up in the Hunter Valley these days?
Well, we're coming into vintage, obviously, right around the country, no doubt. But obviously, in the Hunter, we're usually at the pub by the time the brosses start getting out the tractors. But yeah, it's shaping up to be not as, I don't think, not as outstanding as last year, or sorry, earlier this year.
2013.
Got standard.
14.
Yeah, 2014. We've got standard hunter weather, basically, stinking, muggy, hot days, and then these sort of cool southerly changes roll through in the evening, and they grumble and groan as a storm and don't really dump too much rain down. So, as far I don't know. I'm not a viticulturalist, so
But in terms of the upcoming vintage, I think you're putting together a really interesting kind of program for people, and they can find out more via your website. What's happening with this vintage 2015 thing?
yeah. So vintage 2015. I made some wine earlier this year
Oh
at
wow!
McDale. I had the opportunity just to make some. I asked one of the growers, Ross McDonald, if I could make my own wine and just experience what it was like to make wine. In no way, shape, or form am I a qualified winemaker or wine grower or anything. It was purely just blagging it and seeing what it was like. And actually, I learned a couple of lessons as well.
Yeah.
In that we were bottling up. I'd made two wines. I made, I guess, what you'd call an orange wine and a red wine.
Hashtag serious consequences.
Well, exactly. So I was actually thinking of changing the name to Wine of Orange Hue and having a picture of Hugh Grant on the label.
No, why not have a picture of Hugh and Hook?
Well, that could have worked as well. I didn't want to sort of, kick any ants' nests and stir any sort of pots. But yeah, when we came time to bottling, I was bottling up the red. We bottled the red first, and that was all exciting and amazing and all the rest of it. And then when it came time to bottle the orange, and it was such a beautiful color. It was this sort of copper amber, kind of looked like that mosquito from Jurassic Park. It was just it was
In the crystallized tree sap.
exactly that. So it was this beautiful piece of amber, and in my excitement and complete noviceness, I didn't clear the lines of the previous red bottling. So when I actually put the pipe into the tank, into the beer keg, which we were elvaging the orange wine in, it spilled with some red wine and discolored the orange wine. So it was, it still smells nice. It still tastes really nice. It just looks like a murky pink.
Murky, yeah.
So it was a lesson for me in the fact that, if that was something that I was doing on a commercial scale, which I wasn't, I only made like 2.5 cases, but if I was doing that on a commercial scale and I had sort of, family to feed and maybe some staff to pay wages to and things, and the wine that we'd made wasn't up to snuff and we couldn't sell it.
Yeah.
It was a huge lesson for me in that, mindfulness in the entire process right up to the end is
Details.
so. And I think Andrew Thomas says about the 1%ers, you've got to keep them in mind all the time, and it was true. So as it turns out, I've actually renamed it Dr. Pinkerton's Strange Rosé, and I like drinking it myself. It's quite nice. I took it actually to London with me in April. I took some early bottlings and showed it to John Werdeman and Isabelle Legeron. Actually, they both tasted it. They came over to the stand that I was manning, and they both digged it. So that was cool. But of course, they saw it when it was orange, not when it was murky pink. So
okay, I'll have to get a bottle of it and have a taste myself.
Oh, absolutely. I'll send you one down.
Fantastic, appreciate it. And in fact, even though we met just over a year ago, we actually did bump into each other up in Sydney back in February at the Roostock Festival, the Roostock of Sydney. And I thought would it be interesting, because you've been to some wine festivals, I've been to some this year. Why don't we have a chat about wine festivals?
Yeah, absolutely, man. That sounds like a good plan. Yeah, like you said, we met at Rootstock this year, the second one at Carriage Works, and that was a
Oh, no,
good.
it's the first one at Carriage Works.
Yeah, yeah,
It's the second rootstock, but it's the first time they've done it at Carriage Works.
yeah, that's right. And it was a good couple of days, man. Really, really well put on, and loads of wine. But I actually didn't get to try that many because I was running around doing interviews and
I
trying
saw
to.
you. I did see you with the little microphone, and I had a listen as well. I particularly had interest in your interview with Alice Firing, who was the first time visiting Australia. I didn't realise that. And I know, I've having read her books, particularly the first one, she was somewhat scathing of Australian wine. Obviously, with very broad brushstrokes, kind of writing off almost all Australian wine, but this was obviously in relation to one wine style, and it was one variety, that's Shiraz. So I believe she was actually impressed and surprised to a certain extent to sort of see the revolution going on in Australia.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it would have been a bit of shock and awe actually, because from what I understand, it was sort of a fly in, fly out kind of a trip,
Yeah.
and obviously everyone's pulling at her to try and get a piece of Alice. And she was doing the master classes and stuff, which was really great because you could sort of get a load of what she had to say without being sort of interrupted or have her be pulled off in another direction. But I was very fortunate to secure that sort of, I think it's about a 7.5 minute interview with her
Yeah.
as trains are rolling by and that sort of thing outside of Carriage Works. But
I think that was when you were trying to wrangle her to get a bit of time, was about the same time I was trying to get a photo with her, which I did see a lot of people also trying to get a photo with Alice.
Absolutely. But it was a huge privilege to be able to speak with her for that little amount of time. And yeah, I mean, I think she was surprised. What actually interested me most was at the one of the master classes, one of the wines that was poured as part of the class was Bobar's 20, I think it was their 2013 Syrah. I'll
Was
have
it?
to check that. I'll get the fact checkers onto that. It was either that or the 10, but pretty sure it was the 13. And it was really intriguing to watch her surprise. Like you could literally see the surprise smear across her face, and she was like, "Whoa, is this a wine from Australia?"
Mm.
And that was really cool, to sort of to be there. And I think like you said, she kind of slagged off Australian wine in broad brush strokes in a
Which is
couple.
only natural, pun unintended, considering the vast majority of wine that does get to the United States, where obviously she's based.
Exactly. And I don't know what her experiences are in terms of access and that sort of thing. But in recent years, certainly in the last 18 months, you've got guys like Defend Australia who are really pushing the new vanguard of Aussie wine over there. And Harkham, Richie Harkham, a buddy of mine, he was over there recently, and he said that Americans are gagging for this kind of juice. So
Mm.
it's cool.
Well, let's sort of take it back a little bit, I guess, and talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about wine festivals. There's there's kind of two kinds, in my opinion. There's consumer wine festivals or fairs, and then there are ones for the industry, which are trade and or media oriented. And then I guess the other kind of distinction is events that are run in, I guess, major cities, not necessarily where the wine is being produced. And then you have, events that are run in the regions, whether it is done by a winery or wine business, or whether it's done by the region itself. But I guess going back to the first distinction between consumer and industry, basically in Australia, the wine fairs and festivals are pretty much consumer oriented. Would you agree?
I think so. I mean,
They do, like, trade and media are of course invited along, but there aren't really any kind of industry only. There may be a little bit more technical, like they're more like conferences really, but not in the same kind of in a way that some of the big trade fairs you see over in Europe, and even now you're starting to see in Asia a little bit as well.
yeah, absolutely. For example, the Real Wine Fair it has 2 days. It's spaced over 2 days. One of them is specifically for trade, and one of them is specifically for consumers.
Okay.
I think consumers are allowed to go to the trade days, but generally it's kind of not advertised that way. So I think if they rock up there and it's like trade, then that's okay. But it's held on a Monday. So most, I guess, consumers, regular consumers of wine that probably don't work in the trade, aren't going to go on a Monday anyway, because
Yeah.
that's work.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure it's the same for Raw Fair as well, which is Isabel's fair. And yeah, I mean, there's the huge London Wine Fair as well, and I'm pretty sure they do like the splitting up of days. But obviously, Rootstock, it was a Saturday and a Sunday, and that's designed for consumers to go both days and intermix with obviously various trade peoples as well.
I think that one of the benefits of the Rootstock fair is that generally the industry people who are going to it, the trade people in particular, are a lot more relaxed. It's not sort of a formality, or they're pretty casual about it, and they're out to have a good time, and so that kind of conviviality and like looking at the wines is obviously important, but it's also about connecting and strengthening relationships, that kind of thing, and just having a good time, having a nice big party.
Oh, big time. And that's exactly what Rootstock was just a 2 day giant party. I mean, I after the first day on the Saturday, I remember it was a time we'd all gone back to this joint called Mary's in Newtown. And at one point, I'm standing next to James Erskine from Yalma, having a conversation with him. And then standing next to him is Wayne Ahrens from Small Fry. And then there was Anton von Klopper doing his thing over in, another part of the room. And this is a pretty small room, Tom Schrobrick there, and basically a bunch of guys that you would sort of consider to be the leading lights of this new changing state of Australian wine. Anyway, they're all in this room in Mary's, and there's burgers and fries, and there's like, you might have a glass of wine, but it's a glass, or a wine glass, but it's filled with beer because someone just poured beer into it, or vice versa. And it was this it was a party, it was just like this giant party. And the next day on the Sunday, you could see like some of the weary hangovers and things. Obviously, people had not drunk preservative-free wines and not natural wines, that sort of thing. But it was just a giant 2 day party, and I think that's awesome for wine, because most consumers, I think their perception of wine is that it's a little inaccessible, because it's almost like walking into a physics lecture for the first time if you're an undergrad, and you go, what the hell are they talking about? I have no idea. And so you kind of shy away from it. And we do, a buddy of mine here in Newcastle, we do a series of events called In Greats We Trust Present. And the whole point of that is to get really good booze and kind of just sit around and eat some nice food and chat about it. And I couldn't care less if this was the first glass of wine that you'd ever drunk, or the batrillionth glass of wine. We just don't care. It's all about the food and the wine and the good times. And events like Rootstock really push that accessibility, which is
I think what you're touching on there is really important. That kind of the having an event exclusively for wine it's pretty tough to do, and so you do have to incorporate a certain amount of other elements, most notably food, and even at Rootstock, The huge carriage works space was split up, so that there was the area dedicated to all the wine producers who were showing their wares, but then there was a big open area where there were particularly Sydney restaurateurs who were doing some food, and there was a big coffee cart, and then there were several bars, and so it sort of broke up the space, and even other events like the Sydney International the Sydney International Italian Wine Festival. I think that's what it's called. They've got Italian restaurants cooking some food for people to eat. They've got some demonstrations, cooking classes, that kind of thing. Because like if you're just talking about the responsible service of alcohol, you have to have some food element. That's a pretty much given. But I think people to come and dedicate themselves for however many hours, in some cases it's going to be 4 or 5 hours just to wine, they're going to get a little bit antsy and also, not to mention, a bit drunk as well.
Oh, for sure. Trade. I went to a New Zealand wine taste a couple of weeks ago down in Sydney, and it was.
That was the one with Matthew Jukes.
Yeah. It was an awesome couple of hours, and we had sort of probably about 2 hours worth of wine tasting.
Yeah.
And they were obviously kind enough to give us lunch, and that was awesome. We got to eat and drink some of the wines that we'd just spent, the last couple of hours going through, talking about tasting and so on and so forth. And everything, once the food was on the table, there were wines there that I didn't quite get in isolation when we were just drinking them, just tasting them. But once the food was on the table and we were eating, everything became crystallized and contextualized. And there were wines there that all of a sudden I was like, damn, actually, yeah, that's what this needs, and that's really, I don't know about food and wine matching stuff, and I don't want to sort of derail the conversation, but for me, food and wine, it's just a no-brainer. It's where is it being grown, and the only reason like an Italian red goes well with beautiful pasta is because they happen to be growing, relatively close to each other, and so bringing food at a wine event, whether it's trade or consumer, I think it's a no-brainer. You just have to have it there, because
particularly to consumer, it's putting things in context, because it's certainly something that I've mentioned before, and it probably won't be the last time I mention it either. But for me, wine is a part of dining. It's not necessarily about a beverage, particularly not. Just, you don't drink it just because it's alcohol. It is designed to be going with food to accompany it. And so putting it in that kind of context, as you said, crystallizes it, particularly for a consumer, in a country like Australia where food and wine matching is still a relatively new concept. It's taken for granted, I think, in countries like Italy and France, in the same way that they don't understand it. They just do it. It's just part of the culture.
Yeah, totally. You've got to, I guess, contextualize that within the Australian history of alcoholic consumption. And it's the typical Aussie, down at the pub getting drunk on lagers and things, and that's cool, and that pervades, and that's awesome. But I think what happens in Europe, obviously, is that they have an innate respect. It's probably not necessarily taught as, like a subject, but it's just this thing that you learn via osmosis, that alcohol is something to be respected and generally consumed with food. And I would suggest, if you're drinking wine by itself and you were just to do that at a trade taste or at a consumer event, if you're drinking wine just to get drunk, probably go across to the bar across the road and just drink vodka. It's cheaper, quick.
Yeah. It's interesting that, like what you're talking about there, with the sort of the more prevalent culture in Australia, for example, of drinking and very relaxed and going to the pub, that kind of thing. One of the things that I like about events like Rootstock in particular is that it's trying to kind of meet halfway, and by making it so more accessible and fun, and kind of like, oh, there's no need for pretension, and we're not talking about like technical things, and vintage is, it's just like one of my favorite words that a lot of the guys use is smashable. It's just smashable booze kind of thing. And so it is teaching people to appreciate wine, but also a product that tastes of something and somewhere. But you don't need to geek out on it.
No, exactly, exactly. We had an event last night in Newcastle for Grapes Trust, and um, I was going over some like winemaking notes, and because I got the guys that we were pouring their wines, I got them to send me some spec sheets in regards to how the wine was grown in the vineyard and made in the winery, and I was sort of reading through it. I could have mentioned percentages of oak and whether it was pressed off after 12 days or 14 days or 6 months or whatever it is, and I was just reading it thinking, I care about this. This is interesting for me. The kinds of people that we've got at our events either don't know, and it would just be like speaking physics 101 to them, or don't care. And really, it's about the what's in your glass.
Yeah.
And that's really, for me, that's what it comes down to is what's in the glass. And I can go away later on and geek out about specs and things like that later on, away from other human beings that would find that annoying. So
See, that's the thing. In terms of my day job as a wholesale wine rep, I'm obviously talking to and showing wines to very experienced professionals who understand a lot of the technical kind of jargon, and the impact of certain things you would do on the finished product. But even then, regardless of how experienced they are, I try and keep it fairly simple because, as you say, the proof is in the glass, and at the end of the day, it's whether or not you enjoy it and are happy to pay for it. Like, that's something that it really does get drilled home a lot and just keeps getting forgotten somehow.
pretty much, I mean, exactly. An example, was back in April at Real Wine Fair. Um, that whole event, those 2 days, irrespective of trade day or consumer day, it was literally just to drink wine and explore. I think
Yeah.
explore different tastes, because that's the thing. Exploring different tastes. You'll know it yourself. You sometimes you can drink a bottle of wine and just be like, whoa, what is that? Like, is that
Yeah.
really come from grapes?
Yeah.
At a Blind Corner Governo 2013 last night. It was made from Sauvignon Blanc, and Ben Gould, the wine grower, he takes he picks about 15%, 10 to 15% before the rest of the vineyard is ready.
Yeah.
He picks it early. He rack dries it, air dries it for a couple of days before picking the rest of the Sav and sticking it into a fermenter and fermenting it all together. And like, if you know the Amarone style, you kind of can get to where he's trying to head with that. But this wine tasted it had aromas of blackcurrant in it, a blackcurrant in Sauvignon Blanc, and I was like, whoa, that's awesome, And for me, that was just about the taste rather than getting off on whether or not he'd rack dried a portion of the Sav, for a couple of days before. It was literally about the taste, and everyone else, was the same. It was, man, this is cool.
Well, to be honest, I do sometimes find similar characteristics between Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon
Oh yeah, for sure,
because they
absolutely.
because they are related. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
it's funny how that works, though.
yeah, I guess to be honest, my experience actually with Sauv Blanc in Margs isn't really that extensive.
Yeah.
So I'm talking from a fairly ignorant point of view, but
Well,
from
particularly because in Margaret River, there is more of a tendency to blend it with Semillon,
yeah,
which
totally.
which I would think is something you are familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. and not a huge fan of. But you know, but yeah, I
um,
mean, for what's in the glass, man, it was pretty outstanding.
yeah, awesome. So in terms of it's what I find interesting is the fact that Sydney lately have been running a few more wine festivals and fairs that are, for the most part, dedicated to wine. Whereas Melbourne doesn't really have any events like that. Like there are some really big, and it seems like every other weekend there's one on food and wine festivals. And food is very much the focus. Wine is I hate to say it, but wine tends to be a bit of an afterthought. And I think I know that in speaking with several people in the industry here, they kind of grumble a little bit that the festivals don't dedicate enough money and time into wine events. But I think to a large extent that is kind of consumer led. It's to do with the demand and certainly the big food events, like for example Melbourne Food and Wine Festival next year. They've already opened up ticket sales for some of the big events, and I dare say they're sold out. They have got international chefs coming in, and so these big masterclasses are selling out very fast, but they do still kind of run some masterclasses and specific wine events. A lot of the time, the wine events are run by producers or wine companies. They sort of do it themselves as part of the festival. I don't know. Have you ever been to any of the food and wine festivals, like Taste? Have you ever been to Taste in Sydney?
I try and avoid them. I don't want to sound pretentious, but I personally I don't deal with big crowds of people,
Yeah.
uh, and those sorts of events. I just there is the consumer side that literally are there to get drunk, off free wine samples. I think that's one of the beautiful
Well, whether it's
things.
wine or food, they basically want to get their money's worth. I know, like a few weeks ago, I went to an event that had an internationally recognized chef out of Europe there, and like uh, my friend and I went along, and we actually missed out on several of the dishes because people were just literally standing outside the kitchen and just grabbing stuff, and people who were sort of at the back, the food just didn't even get to them.
Oh, exactly. And that's one of the beautiful things of rootstock is that even if you weren't a huge geek about wine, I really didn't see too many people stumbling around rootstock, drunk. Maybe that had something to do with the way that they structured the tastings, having sort of a limited time limit on those sorts of things. But there wasn't that just, let's go out and get drunk on free wine samples. And
Yeah.
so all due respect to taste, they serve a particular segment of the market, and I'm down with that. That's fine, but I just would try and refrain from those kinds of events because they don't get to the heart of what really wine is, for me anyway, and it's that conviviality and not to get drunk. It's I like the effects of the alcohol, don't get me wrong, but I like them how they sort of creep up on you after a while of talking and eating and carrying on, and you might stand up after 90 minutes or something and be like, oh, I'm a little bit pissy. But you don't go to these events specifically because there's a whole bunch of booze and you can easily get drunk. I mean, for me that's pointless.
Mm.
Pointless.
Mm.
Um,
In terms of regional events, does the Hunter Valley have a like an annual Hunter Valley Wine Festival?
well, I'm glad you asked, James. Thanks for asking. We do, and we have heaps. I mean, the Hunter Valley itself, around Colborne and Rothbury and Lovedale, they have a lot of wine-related events. There's the Lovedale Long Lunch, which is an annual event. It's been going for well over 10 years, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
And Jazz in the Vines, Tyrrell's put that on, and that's usually a pretty good day out. James Morrison, I think, a couple of jazz, musos come up and jam, and it's really cool. And then there's little tasting groups and that sort of thing around the joint. That's all sort of located out in the Hunter Valley itself. In Newcastle, it's a whole different story. We've only just got our first proper wine bar within the last 12 months, and it's sort of like this shining light of wine in Newcastle. And then actually following that, there's a couple of other ones that have started to sort of poke their head up a bit, which is really cool. And I think wine is becoming a little bit more central. But you were talking before about how the food seems to take precedence over the wine at many of the events in Melbourne. Well, earlier this year, so I do this event called What's in Your Glass, which is an annual thing. I started it last year, and it was more just because I wanted to just bring some really deluxe booze to Newcastle and not have to drive to Sydney.
I remember you talking about it on the podcast last time.
Yeah, so we did it again this year, and one of the newspapers, the local rags, sort of contacted us to do a story on the event to find out, what was going on and all the rest of it. And when the story ran, it was pop-up restaurants taking Newcastle by storm or something. And that, they ran the food angle before they ran the wine angle. And the thing was, the event itself was wholly and solely dedicated to wine. We had over 30 producers showcasing their wines at this event, and 4 pop-up restaurants from Newcastle. And they were good restaurants, don't get me wrong. They were some of the best in Newcastle. But it spoke a lot to me in that article, the way that they ran the angle, because, it's largely consumer driven, and it sort of Newcastle, I guess, wouldn't ordinarily come out for a wine event. They'd come out for the food, and then they'd be like, damn, there's like some wine here. Cool. Let's have a crack at it. So it's obviously largely consumer driven. I think in Sydney, they're light years ahead of presenting wine as a beverage that does go well with food, but it is one of the central things during a meal. Newcastle definitely, as much as I think it's like 6th largest city in Australia, but it's still very much a regional centre, and I don't think the population can support or quite get to thinking of wine as an event unto itself.
Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about sort of the stuff that's run in the Hunter Valley itself. They sort of seem like kind of standalone events to a large extent, but certainly in a lot of the regions around Melbourne, and it's possibly because of their ease of access from Melbourne, but a lot of the wine regions have an annual kind of day or 2 days, and often they'll be kind of timed to coincide with something. Like, for example, I worked for several years in the Yarra Valley, and they back then they ran an event called Grape Grazing, and it was I think usually in February or March, but it was supposed to coincide with the vintage. I know that, for example, the Macedon Ranges to the north of Melbourne, I'm not sure if they still do it, but they would do one at the time when it was literally called Bud Burst, when the shoots would start appearing. I know that Barossa Valley have a huge sort of, and I think it's a weekend, and I can't remember if it is part of it or if it just coincides with it. But they have this big kind of German festival on as well. I guess the idea with those kind of events is to get people out to the region and see it for themselves, when they might not otherwise do it. Putting on a big event, having wineries participating and putting on special things, whether it's music or food, that kind of thing. Yeah. That is a way for them to kind of introduce people to the region itself. And I guess sort of now you've got more, the Day on the Green type things where there's big concerts, in some cases international acts coming out, and to go and see a concert in a wine region is possibly, like, for example, this Saturday I'm going up to Mitchelton with my dad. We're going to go and see Jimmy Barnes. So that's, it's an interesting kind of way of getting people out to the wine regions and the wineries.
And it's an amazing setting to watch a live performance they have it a lot in the Hunter Valley. There's Hope Estate, which is a winery that seems to be actually a live music venue come winery kind of thing. And that's cool. It's awesome. Last weekend John Legend played up here.
Yep.
Saw Bruce Springsteen play at the start of the year. The Rolling Stones were recently out, playing out here. We've had Lionel Richie and John Farnham and like loads of people. Elton John, Dolly Parton. It's really awesome actually. Growing up in the Hunter Valley and having these international acts come out to pretty much my backyard, and not having to go down to Sydney. And then off the back of that, obviously, it brings a lot of people into the valley, and they can make, a weekend, a couple of days of it, where they can go and explore the cellar doors that are around where the concert's being held, and sort of engage in wine in a way that maybe they probably wouldn't because they didn't have an excuse. Maybe they're not going to come up to the Hunter to just taste some wine for the weekend. Maybe they need someone like the Rolling Stones or Jimmy Barnes or Bruce Springsteen or whoever to come to the valley and play, and sort of then they can, and as a consequence, as a byproduct, they can, discover wine. Yeah. So I think, I really do. Anything that can kind of promote wine is got to be a good thing.
So you this year and I think in other years as well, you attended the festival over in London, which both consumer and trade. Have you attended any of the pretty much the trade oriented wine fairs?
I would say probably not. I know Handmade in you had Handmade a couple of months ago.
That was consumer.
That was consumer, was it?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I saw some of the pics and it looked pretty awesome. It was like a chock-a-block full of people in the room.
You should definitely come down for it next year, mate.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to.
They're going much larger next year.
Nice. As far as trades, sometimes I get to Sydney as and when I can for trade taste, but they're definitely not sort of on that festival scale.
Yeah, because we don't really have any in Australia. I was having a conversation the other day and kind of wondering why, because I've actually had the opportunity 2 years ago. I visited the Pro Wine Fair, which they hold in Dusseldorf in Germany each year. And then I went to Vinitaly, which is probably the biggest in Verona. And anyone kind of comes up and shows their wares in Italy. I guess probably the other big one is Vinexpo, which I think every other year it's in Bordeaux and then in Hong Kong, I think. And there is not so much for Pro Wine, but Vinitaly. I think there's one day when it's open to the general public, but again, it is focused much more on business, and you feel it. You feel walking around. It's so much more about presentation, and a lot of cases, it's meetings. You're meeting with customers or importers, and it's almost not even about tasting the wine. Yeah, that sort of is incorporated, but it's really about sort of discussing how things are tracking and how much volume you have for the new vintage that you're releasing, and allocations, that sort of stuff, ways of kind of growing business. It's a really different kind of vibe at the trade fairs. I've only had the opportunity to visit a couple, but it did sort of surprise me how different that felt.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm a struggling wine writer, because I would go to those events and I would be bored. Personally, I'd be bored. And they are great for conducting business and for making network associations and plans and getting some of the more hard and fast aspects of the wine industry together, and they serve a purpose like that. But for me, as I come at wine from a consumer perspective anyway. I've worked behind a bar before I sort of decided to take my journalistic skills and meld it with the wine stuff. But so I just come at it from a consumer perspective anyway, and events like that, and I've never been to them, so I really can't comment completely or at all really. But I'm pretty sure I'd be pretty I would be looking to get drunk off wine, but yeah, it's interesting. I think the future of sort of where wine events need to go, they in order to ingratiate themselves with new customers, is to make them more gregarious, make them more appealing, and less sort of break the barriers down. And it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but throw some beanbags on the floor and have like a couple of music stations over thing with headphones, and you can just sort of put some music on and sit in a beanbag and just drink some wine. And if you want to get in a little kumbaya circle, chat about what you're drinking, sweet as. Or festivals like Rootstock, there was a DJ at the back of the carriage works, and he was pumping out some tunes. I don't know, it was cool.
One of the things that I liked about Rootstock was that it's about accessibility, and so you had access to the people who are actually making these wines. So if you have experience with those wines in the market, you're tasting them at a bar or a restaurant, you can actually meet the person who made it. But also, you talked about masterclasses. Masterclasses can be a really interesting component of a wine event. They don't have to be so formal. They can be a little bit more conversational. But I know that particularly at Rootstock, there were people like Alice, like Max Allen, and then also people who work in the trade, sommeliers like Badger Harris Plain. They were conducting, really interesting talks, doing something a little bit different, but it gave people the opportunity to actually meet these people and ask them questions and kind of, as you say, break down the barriers a little bit. Like you saw these guys walking around, you could just go up and say, hey, look, I've read your book, I really loved it. Or, oh, I got introduced to your wine last year by a friend of mine, and I keep an eye out for it everywhere I go. And, so that kind of thing is, I think, really, really helpful. And so kind of breaking down the barriers and bringing the elements between consumers, media, producers, and trade closer to each other, and it's sort of, that's what I think there's a little bit too much of in the wine industry, is a little bit of pretension and pomposity and kind of trying to increase the distance between the end consumer and the professionals, which I think is a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can talk to the person that actually, spent 10, 12 months in the vineyard, growing, nurturing the vines, applying all the preparations, sprays, mowing between the rows, that sort of thing, spends all that time in the winery, going through fermentation, making various decisions and that sort of thing in the winery, and then, bottling it, sending it out. If you can talk to that person, that's pretty much the best thing ever. It'd be like talking to, what's his name, Mick Jagger, and asking him about, the songwriting process or something. Obviously, I don't want to compare winemakers with rock stars. I think that gets done way too much in the wine industry, but
often very negatively.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess it's the cult of the celebrity. It's I don't know. I personally come at wine growers from a perspective of, I mean, they're just farmers, and they're amazing people. But I'd also like to go to an awards dinner for the plumber or like the electrician's annual ball or something. I mean,
artisans.
Yeah, they're just human beings, and they just happen to make a really beautiful, beguiling, beverage. But that's the beauty of something like Rootstock, or like a real wine fair, or like a raw fair, or like any of those kinds of fairs, and they don't necessarily have to be from natural, organic, biodynamic kind of stables. That just seems to be how it's occurring. But to actually talk to the person, the human being behind that bottle in the flesh there while you're drinking it, and have them explain it to you, how this particular wine came about. That's magic. That's the best. That's the story. And people love to attach themselves to the story. And the more that can happen, and the more that events like Rootstock and Raw and Real Wine Fair, and if I can be so bold as to count what's in your glass amongst that, but that's awesome for wine, and it gets people engaging with wine as something that's more than the 3 for $25 at Uncle Dan's, you know?
I completely agree. Look, mate, I think that is a great spot to finish up on. Thank you very much for joining me today.
You're very welcome, man. Thanks for inviting me back. It's pretty cool.
And let the listeners know again, what's the best way of keeping in touch with you and finding out about all the exciting things you've got going on in 2015?
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, I mean, the easiest way for people to get in touch is to just go to thewineIdealist.com, and there's links to various ventures that I've got going on at the moment. Wine Idealist Tours, Vintage 2015, and obviously the weekly editions, which will keep coming out in 2015. And I've got some plans to sort of tweak that a little bit and get some new voices onto the website, so that you don't have to keep me prattling on about how the vineyard's so important, and that organics and biodynamics is the best way to do things. I want to get some different perspectives, some different opinions.
Awesome.
Talking on the website. So, that's cool. WineIdealist.com. Otherwise, standard sort of things. Twitter @The Wine Idealist, and on the book face, it's I think facebook.com/The Wine Idealist. But it's all on The Wine Idealist. Just go there. It's cool.
Yeah, make sure you follow and send a message to Daniel and ask him any questions. Really try and test him. But mate, I look forward to catching up with you in the new year, and hopefully getting you back on the podcast.
Right on, man. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on, dude.
Have a good Christmas, mate.
See ya.
As always, guys, thank you very much for listening to the Vincast. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I am @IntrepidWino, but on Twitter you can also follow the podcast @the Vincast. Do come and visit me at intrepidwino.com. Lots of fun things to find, not just the podcast. But do jump onto iTunes and Stitcher, subscribe to the podcast, rate and review whilst you're there. I would love to receive some feedback, and it really helps me out. But until next time, bye.